My name is Silas Blackwood, or at least it was. For 44 years I did something impossible, and I'm telling you this now because my name is no longer on any records. The government made sure of that. I protected a Bigfoot after finding it wounded on my property in the Olympic National Forest, but that isn't the real secret. It's the beginning, but not the end. The real secret is what happened when the FBI found us, and why I had to disappear forever. The truth is stranger than any campfire story you've ever heard, and it's heavier than any stone. It's a truth about a lonely creature, yes, but it's also about our own government and a program so dark they were willing to erase a man's entire existence just to keep it buried. I'm recording this on a series of old cassette tapes, my last act. To believe me, you have to understand where this all began and why I was the only one who could have kept this secret for so long. It starts with the silence, and a promise I made to myself. To believe what I'm about to tell you, you have to understand the silence of this place. I came out here to the Olympic Peninsula after my tour, seeking a quiet that wasn't empty. You learn the difference when you've been in the jungle. There's the dead quiet that means you're being hunted, and then there's the living quiet, which is never truly quiet at all. Here, there's the sound of the wind through the old-growth Douglas firs, a low, constant moan like a ship's hull groaning in a heavy sea. There's the specific, rhythmic drumming of rain on my cabin's tin roof, a sound so familiar you can tell the season just by its tempo. A light patter in spring, a heavy, relentless thrumming in late fall, and the sharp crackle of a log shifting in the wood stove. The sound of warmth and safety. These sounds were my company. They were the language of my solitude, the proof that I was alone, but not in an empty world. This living silence was what I came here to find, and I guarded it fiercely. I came here to heal from a wound you couldn't see. It was a guilt I carried home from the war, the kind that settles deep in your bones for being the one who came back when so many others didn't. I felt like a ghost walking among the living. So I made a world with just me and the trees, a place where the past couldn't reach me as easily. My property is 30 acres of dense timber and steep ravines, bordered by the National Forest on 3 sides. It's not a place you stumble upon. My days fell into a simple, hard rhythm, chopping wood, mending fences, checking my snares for rabbits, listening to the static hiss of my shortwave radio at night. I wasn't hiding from the world so much as I was creating a new one with rules I understood, one where the only ghosts were the wisps of fog that crept up from Whisper Creek in the morning. I thought I had found a peace that would last until my final day. I was wrong. I had only found the stage for something else entirely. For years, that peace held. I built my credibility on knowing the forest's language. I knew the sharp barking alarm of a squirrel meant a hawk was circling overhead. I knew the way the air grew heavy and still just before a summer thunderstorm would break over the ridge. And then there was the other silence, the one I learned to fear. It's a silence that falls suddenly, when all the small noises of the forest, the insects, the birds, the rustle of leaves, just stop. It's like the world holds its breath. That's the silence that tells you a predator is on the prowl. A cougar, usually, or a black bear. Your instincts scream before you even know why. The hair on your arm stands up, and you find yourself scanning the tree line, your hand reaching for a hatchet or a rifle without even thinking. That silence is a warning, a primal signal that you are no longer the one watching. You are the one being watched. I had felt it a dozen times, but I had never felt it like I did on that day in '79. It was a late fall day in 1979. The rain had been falling for a week straight, that heavy, cold torrent that turns the forest floor into a mire of mud and decaying leaves. The sky was a low, gray ceiling, and the air smelled of wet cedar and damp earth. I was inside, by the fire, listening to the steady drumming on the tin roof, feeling safe. Then a different sound cut through the rain. It wasn't natural. It was a deep, resonant crack, the sound of thick bone and old metal giving way at the same time. It was immediate, violent, and final. It was followed, a second later, by a guttural roar of pain that shook the windows in their frames. I've heard a lot of things in these woods. I've heard the scream of a mountain lion, the bellow of a bull elk, the angry huff of a cornered bear. This was none of those. This was the sound of intelligent agony. It was a sound that knew what had happened to it, and was enraged by the sheer, stupid injustice of it. Every instinct for self-preservation I had honed over the years screamed at me to stay inside, to bar the door, load the shotgun, and wait for morning. The forest is unforgiving, and its troubles are not yours. Whatever was out there was big, it was hurt, and it was angry. Going out there in the fading light, in a storm, was a fool's errand. A man seeking a quiet life has no business investigating a sound like that. It's the kind of decision that gets you written about in a small column in the local paper, under the headline, "Local Hermit Found Mauled." But as I stood there, listening to the rain and the echo of that roar, another voice spoke inside me, one I hadn't heard in a long time. It was the voice that remembered leaving men behind. It was the voice that knew what it felt like to be trapped and bleeding, waiting for a fate you couldn't control. Some things you don't walk away from. Not twice. Against my own better judgment, I grabbed my old bolt-action rifle from the rack by the door and a heavy storm lantern. I didn't grab the rifle to hunt, but for the same reason you carry a fire extinguisher. You hope to God you never have to use it. I lit the lantern, the wick catching with a soft whoosh, and its yellow light pushed back against the encroaching dusk. Stepping outside was like stepping into another world. The wind and rain hit me at once, cold and biting. The lantern's light cast a small, swaying circle of clarity in a universe of darkness and chaos. Beyond its reach, the ancient trees were just black columns disappearing into the gray sky. The roar didn't come again, but the memory of it was enough. I followed the sound's direction, heading west towards the old logging trail that bordered my property. Each step a squelch in the cold mud. The only sounds now were the storm and the frantic, unsteady beating of my own heart. I found it about a quarter-mile from my cabin, just past a thicket of salmonberry bushes. The lantern light slid over wet leaves and fell upon a scene of brutal simplicity. A rusted, forgotten bear trap, a huge thing with cruel metal teeth, was clamped shut. It was a relic from the property's previous owner, a ghost of past violence I'd never gotten around to removing. And caught in it was something enormous. At first, in the swaying light, it was just a mass of dark, matted hair, impossibly tall even as it was contorted on the ground. Its breath was coming in ragged gasps, each exhalation a thick plume of fog in the cold air. One of its legs, thick as a tree trunk, was caught in the trap's jaws. The bone was clearly broken, twisted at an unnatural angle. The metal teeth of the trap had bitten deep, and the ground around it was dark with blood, diluted by the pouring rain. It was a scene of pure, savage misery. I raised the lantern higher. Its light fell upon a face. It was not the face of a bear or an ape from some zoo. The brow was heavy, the jaw powerful, but the eyes were what stopped me cold. They were fixed on me, and they were not the simple, reactive eyes of an animal. They were ancient, intelligent, and filled with a weary, calculating pain. It watched my every move as I stood there, frozen, the rain dripping from the brim of my hat. In my left hand, the rifle felt impossibly heavy and useless. In my right, the lantern felt like a fragile toy. This giant, wounded thing didn't snarl or threaten me. It just watched, its chest rising and falling with labored breaths, as if waiting to see what I would do. It was judging me, and in that moment, I knew that pulling the trigger would be an act of murder, not mercy. I lowered the rifle and slowly, carefully, set it down on the ground. I backed away slowly, never taking my eyes off it, and returned to my workshop. My hands were shaking, but my mind was clear. I wasn't thinking about what it was, or where it came from. I was thinking about the trap, about the bone, about those eyes. I grabbed the heaviest set of bolt cutters I owned, a pair that weighed a good 15 pounds, and a small pry bar. Walking back, the weight of the steel in my hands felt right in a way the rifle hadn't. When I re-entered the clearing, it hadn't moved. It watched me approach again, this time with tools instead of a weapon. I got down on one knee in the mud, just out of its reach, and showed it the cutters. I didn't say a word. I just held them up. It made a low sound in its throat, a deep rumble, but it didn't move. It understood. That single moment of trust, a silent agreement between man and something else, was the birth of our pact. A trade is a trade. It's life for my silence. I worked the jaws of the bolt cutters around the thick spring steel of the trap. The metal was old and resisted, groaning under the pressure. The creature remained unnervingly still, its massive form tense, its eyes locked on the tool in my hands. I put all my weight into it, my muscles straining, until finally, with a loud, violent snap, the spring broke. The trap's jaws sprang open, The creature let out a low, shuddering breath, a sound of profound relief. It didn't try to stand. It just lay there for a long moment. Then slowly, painfully, it began to drag itself away, its mangled leg leaving a dark trail behind it. It disappeared into the shadows of the deep woods, as silent as a ghost. I was left alone in the downpour, with a broken trap, a useless rifle, and a secret that was now mine to carry. In that moment, I made my first real choice. I wouldn't tell a soul. Who would believe me? I buried the trap the next day. I decided to remain quiet. My life had been defined by silence, and now it would be defined by a new one. If you've ever kept a secret so heavy you thought it might break you, or if you've ever looked into the eyes of something and seen more than the world told you was there, then please, stay with me. Like this story, subscribe to the channel, and share this with someone who knows what it's like to be truly alone. Because what happened next, the gifts that started appearing on my porch, and the rules of our silent bargain, that's when I learned that I wasn't just protecting a creature. I was part of something much, much older. You need to hear what came next. For 2 days after, the silence in the woods was the wrong kind. It was the dead quiet, the one that meant something was holding its breath. I kept expecting to hear that roar again, or to find a massive, broken body at the edge of the clearing. But there was nothing. The rain washed away the blood, the forest floor swallowed the tracks, and it was as if it never happened. I found the discarded bear trap, its metal teeth grinning uselessly at the sky. I used a shovel and buried it deep, piling rocks on the disturbed earth. It felt like burying a crime, but the image of those intelligent, pain-filled eyes wouldn't leave me. I knew it was out there, wounded and likely starving. I couldn't just let it be. The pact I made was to remain silent, but my conscience demanded more. Helping once wasn't enough. True help is not a single act, it's a commitment. I knew what I had to do next, even if it meant risking everything. That evening, I did something that went against every rule of survival I had ever learned. I went back to the clearing, deliberately making myself vulnerable. I carried a bucket, not a rifle. Inside, I had packed a thick poultice of yarrow and sphagnum moss to draw out infection, along with half a dozen of the biggest salmon I had smoked that fall. I set the bucket down right at the spot where the trap had been. It felt like a strange, primitive offering. I stood there for a moment, the air cold on my face, and I spoke out loud for the first time, my voice sounding rough and foreign in the quiet. "This is a trade," I said to the empty trees. "For the trap." I didn't know if it could understand the words, but I hoped it would understand the intent. I backed away slowly, feeling 1,000 unseen eyes on me, and returned to my cabin. The door bolted behind me, feeling flimsy and foolish. For nearly a week, nothing happened. Each morning I would go out, and the bucket would be empty. I'd refill it with more fish, or sometimes strips of jerky and a handful of apples from my small orchard. But there were no signs, no sounds, no glimpses of movement in the trees. The doubt started to creep in, cold and persistent. Maybe it had just been a severely injured bear, and my mind, starved for meaning in my isolation, had filled in the rest. Maybe it had taken the food and moved on, or died from its wounds somewhere deep in the forest. The silence of the woods became expectant, and I felt like a man waiting for a letter that would never arrive. I was making offerings to a ghost. I almost gave up. On the 7th day, I decided it would be the last time. If the bucket was empty with no reply, the deal was off. That morning, I unbolted the door and stepped onto my porch, and my heart stopped. There, neatly placed on the top step, was a perfectly arranged pile of chanterelle mushrooms. They weren't just dumped there. They were stacked carefully in a small pyramid, the largest ones at the bottom, the smallest at the top. Golden, fresh, and smelling of the deep woods. It was an unmistakable gesture. It wasn't scavenging. It was a reply. It was a gift. The pact was real. A wave of something, relief, fear, awe, washed over me so intensely I had to grip the doorframe to steady myself. The mushrooms weren't just food. They were a word in a language I was only just beginning to learn. He was out there. He was healing, and he had accepted the terms. A trade is a trade. My silence and my help, in exchange for this. The secret I was keeping was no longer just a memory. It was alive. This exchange became the new rhythm of my life. Every few days, I would leave a bucket of provisions at the edge of the clearing, fish, a hindquarter of a deer, root vegetables from my garden, and in return, things would appear on my porch. Sometimes it was food, like a bundle of wild onions or a branch heavy with huckleberries, left just so. Other times, it was more practical. A massive pile of dry, seasoned kindling stacked by my woodshed just before the first snow. The ritual was the anchor of my days, a silent conversation that gave my solitude a profound and dangerous purpose. I was no longer just a man living alone in the woods. I was a guardian, a partner in a pact that existed outside of any law or human understanding. I felt a sense of loyalty to this creature that was fiercer than any I had ever felt for a person, even myself. I began to learn the unspoken rules of our arrangement through trial and error. The first rule was, you do not stare. One evening at dusk, I caught a glimpse of him at the far edge of the creek, a massive, dark silhouette against the fading light. He was standing upright, watching my cabin. My breath caught in my throat. I raised my binoculars, a stupid, intrusive impulse, and for a second, I had a clear view of his powerful form. The moment the glass focused on him, he was gone. He didn't run. He simply melted back into the shadows of the old-growth forest, becoming one with the darkness. The message was clear. I was allowed to know he was there, but I was not allowed to watch. Observation was a violation. To see was to hunt, and I was not a hunter. From that day on, I learned to see him by not looking. The second rule I learned was about sound. I started hearing a strange noise on certain days, a series of 3 deep, low-frequency hums that seemed to vibrate in my chest more than my ears. They came from the direction of the North Ridge, a sound so low it was almost subliminal. The first time I heard it, the sky was clear and I thought nothing of it, dismissing it as distant logging equipment or some trick of the wind. 2 hours later, a violent squall came screaming down from the mountains with no warning, a furious wind that tore a section of roofing from my shed. I spent the night listening to the storm, and I remembered the hums. It was a warning. The woods have their own language, and he was translating it for me. This wasn't just a trade of goods, it was a trade of information, of survival. I didn't have to wait long to test the theory. Weeks later, on a beautiful, cloudless afternoon, I heard them again. 3 deep, resonant hums, rolling down the valley like invisible thunder. This time, I didn't hesitate. I dropped what I was doing and spent the next hour securing everything that wasn't tied down. I brought in the last of the firewood, latched the shutters on the windows, and checked the seals on my doors. My nearest neighbor, a farmer 5 miles down the road, would have thought I was mad. But just as dusk began to settle, the sky turned a bruised purple and a freak hailstorm broke loose. Chunks of ice the size of robin's eggs hammered the forest, shredding leaves and denting my tin roof with a deafening roar. I sat inside, safe and warm, listening to the storm and understanding that our pact had just deepened. He wasn't just an animal I was feeding. He was a watchman. The gifts became more than just food or warnings. They became acts of protection. One morning, I found a large rattlesnake lying dead just a few yards from my woodshed. It was over 5 feet long, thick as my forearm. Its head had been crushed by a single, precise application of immense force. I hadn't even known it was there. I often worked in that shed barefoot in the summer, reaching into dark corners for tools. The snake had been left not as a trophy, but as evidence of a threat removed. He was patrolling the area, my small island of civilization in his vast wilderness, and eliminating dangers before I ever knew they existed. The feeling was unnerving and deeply comforting. It was a stark reminder of the power he possessed, and the fact that, for now, that power was aligned with my own well-being. What was he protecting me from? I started to wonder if it was more than just the snakes. The most profound lesson in our silent communication came one spring. I was heading down my usual trail to check on the creek levels after the snowmelt. As I neared a steep switchback, I saw something odd on the path. A string of strange, smooth river stones, arranged in a perfect arrow. The arrow pointed away from my trail, towards a much older, overgrown game path. It was so deliberate, so out of place, that it stopped me in my tracks. My first instinct was to ignore it and stick to the path I knew. But the rattlesnake, the mushrooms, the hums, they had taught me to trust these signs. I followed the arrow. 50 yards down the game path, it reconnected with my main trail. When I looked back, I saw why I had been diverted. The switchback I had been about to take was gone. A landslide had washed it out completely, leaving a sheer 100-foot drop into the ravine below. The stones had saved my life. With this growing trust came a growing curiosity. I had to know more. I knew his general territory was the North Ridge, the wildest and most inaccessible part of my land. One afternoon, armed with nothing but a canteen and a compass, I decided to break one of my own rules. I would follow him. I found his tracks near the creek, enormous, deep impressions in the mud, and followed them uphill. They led me through dense thickets of devil's club and over moss-covered deadfall, climbing steadily towards the ridge. The tracks were easy to follow, almost too easy. They led me straight to a landmark I knew well, a single, ancient cedar tree, struck by lightning a century ago, its bleached, skeletal trunk pointing to the sky. As my foot crossed the invisible line marked by the tree's shadow, a sound shattered the silence. A sharp, violent crack of a massive branch breaking high on the ridge above me. It wasn't an accident. It was a gunshot made of wood. It meant, stop. It meant, no further. The message was absolute. This was a boundary, and I was not welcome to cross it. The most mysterious gift, the one that truly began to haunt me, appeared a few months after I learned about the boundary. It was left in the usual spot on my porch, but it was not food, and it was not a warning. It was a small, crudely carved wooden bird. The object was obviously old, the wood worn smooth and dark, as if it had been held and rubbed by a thumb for years. The shape was simple, almost abstract, but it was unmistakably a bird in flight. I picked it up. It felt warm in my hand. And I knew, with absolute certainty, that he could not have made it. His hands were immense, powerful, built for breaking branches and crushing bone, not for delicate, patient work like this. This bird was made by a human hand, or at least a hand like one. Where did he get it? Was it a relic from a hiker he'd observed? Or did it mean something else entirely? A small secret he kept was now mine. This bird was different from the other gifts. The mushrooms could be explained away as a coincidence. The dead snake, an act of a territorial animal. Even the warning hums could be dismissed by a skeptic as geological phenomena. But this was an artifact. It was a piece of a story I couldn't even begin to guess. It implied a past, a connection to the human world, or something stranger. It was a piece of evidence, and the moment I realized that, a cold knot of fear tightened in my stomach. Evidence is something that can be found. A secret is only safe as long as it has no physical form. I couldn't just leave it on my mantelpiece. I took the small wooden bird and walked to the old footlocker at the end of my bed, the one where I kept my father's war medals and my late wife's letters. I wrapped the bird in an old oilcloth and buried it at the very bottom, under 40 years of my own history. The pact was now fully formed, a living, breathing part of my world. A trade is a trade. My life was no longer defined by a quiet solitude, but by a silent partnership. The crushing loneliness I had brought back from the jungle had been replaced by a different weight, the constant, humming tension of the secret and a profound, unspoken loyalty. I was the keeper of a fragile peace between two worlds, the bridge between a man who had left society and a creature that had never been part of it. The woods were no longer a place for me to hide from my ghosts. They were a place where I had a purpose, a duty. For years, this delicate balance held. But the outside world, with its noise and its greed and its relentless curiosity, was coming. And I knew, deep in my bones, that our quiet sanctuary was living on borrowed time. Over the decades, our ritual became the rhythm of my life, a silent language spoken in offerings and signs. These were the quiet years, the episodes of our shared solitude. I had an old shortwave radio I'd listen to at night. The static-laced melodies from distant cities feeling like messages from another planet. I'd often tune into a classical station from Seattle, the mournful sound of a cello filling my small cabin. Soon, a pattern emerged. From the dark ridge, I'd hear a response, a series of wood knocks, deep and resonant. At first I thought it was a coincidence, but then I noticed the cadence. When the music was slow and somber, the knocks were spaced far apart, patient and low. When the piece became more frantic, the knocks would quicken, an urgent, percussive echo. He was listening. We were sharing music, across a valley, across a species. A trade is a trade, and this one felt like sharing a soul. The deepest proof of our bond came the year I lost Sarah, my wife. She passed from cancer, a slow and cruel fading that left me hollowed out. I buried her myself, on a small knoll overlooking the creek, beneath a canopy of hemlocks. For days after, I couldn't bring myself to go back inside the empty cabin. I just sat by the fresh mound of earth, the silence of the woods now filled with her absence. I knew he was there. I could feel his presence at the tree line, a great, silent shape watching me in my grief, a sentinel standing vigil. He didn't approach, respecting the sacred circle of my sorrow. But the next morning, when I returned with a cup of coffee, something was lying on the soil of her grave. A single, perfect, high-altitude glacier lily. Its petals were a pale, translucent white, a flower that had no business growing at this elevation. To find it, he would have had to travel miles up into the high peaks. The woods have rules, but he broke one for me. The outside world began to intrude, its noise a violation of our sanctuary. It started with the loggers. A timber company bought the rights to clear-cut a nearby slope, and the forest's living quiet was replaced by the constant, angry buzz of their chainsaws. The sound was a wound, a daily assault that made the woods feel smaller, more fragile. The air, once clean, now carried the tang of diesel and sawdust. During this time, his gifts became more frequent, almost insistent. Piles of firewood appeared by my door, larger than ever before. A perfectly clean deer hide was left on my porch, as if to say, "You have all you need right here. Don't go out there." The forest was shrinking, and he seemed to be reinforcing the borders of my small world, trying to keep it intact against the encroaching tide. It felt less like a trade and more like a desperate act of preservation. He was protecting our home. The loggers grew bolder, pushing closer to my property line. They started using old, forgotten trails that hadn't seen a boot print in 50 years. Trails that ran uncomfortably close to the deep woods where he sheltered. My days were now filled with a new, anxious ritual, walking the perimeter of my land, looking for signs of their trespass. I'd find their brightly colored flagging tape tied to branches, an alien desecration against the bark. I'd find their discarded oil cans and lunch wrappers. I started meticulously covering his tracks near the creek, using a pine bough to sweep the mud clean, erasing the evidence of his passage. One afternoon, I found a pink ribbon tied to a branch of the old, dead cedar tree, the boundary, my boundary. I ripped it down with a surge of cold fury. These men were blind. They were walking into a church and seeing only lumber. This place has rules, and they were about to break them. The inevitable confrontation came not with a bang, but with the rumble of a pickup truck coming up my long, rutted driveway. It was the logging company's foreman, a man with a hard face and eyes that measured everything in board feet. He said his map showed an old access road that cut through a corner of my land, and using it would save his crew a week of work. He was polite, but his request was an order wrapped in a question. I stood on my porch, leaning on an old axe handle, and let the silence stretch out. I let him see the wildness in my eyes, the look of a man who has spent too much time alone. "There is no road," I said, my voice flat. "There's just my land, and you're not welcome on it." I didn't raise my voice. I didn't have to. I had spent years cultivating a reputation as the crazy hermit of Whisper Creek. Now, I was cashing it in. He left, but not before giving the woods a long, suspicious look. The threat was no longer just a sound. It now had a face. The loggers' activity. And my hostile reaction stirred up the local gossip. In the small-town general store, I'd hear whispers. Men from the logging crew were telling stories about strange noises at night, about one of their bulldozers being moved, about feeling watched from the trees. This talk acted like chum in the water, and it attracted a new kind of invasive species, the Sasquatch hunters. They weren't scientists. They were weekend warriors from the city, armed with night vision cameras, thermal drones, and a sense of entitlement that was even more dangerous than the loggers: greed. They saw the forest not as a home, but as a stage for their adventure. Their presence was a new and terrifying threat, one that was silent, technological, and hunted in the dark. They weren't looking for lumber, they were looking for him. The near disaster happened on a moonless night in August. I was on my porch when I saw it, a small black drone, its single red light blinking like a malevolent star, moving silently over the canopy. A cold dread seized me. I knew he often came to the creek at this hour to drink. From the ridge opposite my cabin, I heard the faint, excited shouts of the hunters. "I got something. Big heat signature by the water. I think I got him. The words traveled across the valley. A death sentence carried on the night air. They had found him. In my mind, I saw it all. The grainy thermal image on their screen, the frantic call to a tabloid, the flood of people that would follow, the end of everything. My silence was about to be broken by force. My secret was about to become a spectacle. I didn't think. I reacted. I burst back into my cabin, grabbed the 12 gauge from the wall, and ran out into the darkness, but away from the creek, towards the opposite side of my property. I needed to create a diversion, a chaotic, human mess that would corrupt their data and their nerve. I pointed the shotgun at the empty sky and fired 2 deafening blasts. The sound ripped through the quiet forest. Then I started screaming, a wild, unhinged torrent of curses at an imaginary bear. "Get out of here, you son of a bitch! Get away from my woodpile!" I made myself the monster. I became the crazy old coot from the stories, a raving lunatic firing a gun into the night. It was a desperate performance, and I put my entire soul into it, praying it would be enough to make them second-guess what they were seeing. For a long moment, there was only the echo of my shotgun and the sound of my own ragged breathing. Then, I heard the hunters on the ridge, their voices now frustrated and annoyed. "It's just that crazy old bastard, Blackwood. He's scaring everything off." I heard their truck start up, its headlights cutting a swath through the trees as they drove away in disgust. The drone's red light blinked once more and then disappeared over the ridge. The woods fell silent again. But the silence was different. It was the silence of a near miss, the kind that leaves your ears ringing. I stumbled back to my porch and collapsed into my chair, the shotgun heavy across my lap, my body trembling. The cost of my secret had just gone up. I was no longer just a keeper of a pact. I was a guard, and the walls of my sanctuary were paper thin. The next morning, there was no gift on my porch. The bucket of provisions I left at the clearing remained untouched. For 3 days, then a week, there was nothing. The living silence of the woods was gone, replaced by an empty, hollow quiet that reminded me of the days right after Sarah passed. I walked the trails, calling his name under my breath, a word I'd never spoken to him. The fear that I had scared him away for good was a physical ache in my chest. I imagined him deep in the wilderness, having decided that proximity to me was too dangerous. The shotgun blasts, the yelling. I had brought the noise and violence of the human world directly into his. My protection had become a threat. The loneliness returned, but it was 100 times heavier now, because I finally understood I hadn't been alone at all. I sat with that emptiness and began to question everything. Was I the real danger here? My very presence, my cabin, my human scent. It was an anchor that drew the outside world closer to him. The loggers, the hunters, they came because of a boundary that I had created. Maybe the most selfless act of protection would be to disappear myself. I seriously contemplated it. I could pack a few things, walk away, and just never come back. Let the forest reclaim my cabin. Let the memory of me fade until I was just another local ghost story. What was I protecting him from? From the world. Yes, but maybe, more importantly, from me. It was a choice between my loyalty to him and my desire for this strange, profound companionship. And I didn't know the answer. On the 8th day, the pact was renewed, but the terms had changed. When I opened my door in the morning, a gift was on the porch, placed directly in the center of the top step where I couldn't miss it. It wasn't food. It was a small-a's curated collection of objects. There was a rusted pocket knife someone had lost years ago, a shard of a green bottle, worn smooth and milky by the creek, and last, placed right on top, was a single, spent 12-gauge shotgun shell. My shell. The one I had fired into the air. He had found it. He had brought it to me. The message was unmistakable, and it sent a chill down my spine. It said, "I saw what you did. I heard the noise. I understand the danger. This is our world now." It was not an accusation. It was an acknowledgement. Our pact of quiet trade was over. A new pact of shared danger had begun. That shotgun shell changed my focus. The incident with the hunters had proven I could protect the perimeter, but it had also ignited a deeper, more urgent curiosity. Why was he so fiercely tied to this specific territory? Any other creature would have migrated away from the logging, the noise, the drones. But he stayed. He held his ground. My attention turned to the one place he had explicitly forbidden me to go. The North Ridge. and the abandoned silver mine whose entrance gaped like a dark mouth in the hillside. I realized the wood knocks, his silent conversations, always stopped when my walks took me too near that mine. The dead cedar wasn't just a random boundary, it was a warning sign, a perimeter fence around something specific. The question that had governed my life for years, "What is he?" suddenly felt small and irrelevant. A new question took its place, one that burned in my mind with a low, constant heat. What was he protecting in there? The realization hit me that I had been looking at everything backward. He wasn't just hiding from the world in my woods. He was guarding something. The fierce territorial defense, the warnings, the refusal to leave despite the escalating danger. It all pointed to something hidden deep within that old mine. Something more important than his own safety. I understood then that I was only on the first layer of the secret. Our pact, the gifts, the shared solitude. It was all built on a foundation I couldn't see. The real mystery wasn't the creature standing in the shadows. It was what he was standing in front of. And I had a terrible feeling that the answer was buried under tons of rock, on the far side of a line I had been warned never to cross. The true turning point, the moment that shattered our fragile pact and forged something far deeper and more terrifying, came the winter I turned 70. The years had begun to stiffen my joints and slow my step, but a man alone doesn't have the luxury of aging gracefully. The work is always there. That November, a series of early, heavy snows had been followed by a hard freeze, casing the entire forest in a brittle sheath of ice. A branch, heavy with the weight, had torn loose and ripped a length of gutter from the cabin roof. Leaving it would mean a wall of ice forming against the logs. A death sentence for the structure. The job couldn't wait. It was a simple, mundane task, the kind you do 1,000 times without a thought. But the forest doesn't care about routine. It only cares about a single moment of lost footing. That's all it takes. The old wooden ladder felt slick and unreliable under my boots. I was up near the roofline, my breath pluming in the frigid air, my fingers numb and clumsy as I tried to hammer a new bracket into the frozen wood. I shifted my weight, just an inch, and that's when it happened. The ladder's feet slid on a patch of unseen ice. There was no time to react, only a sickening sensation of falling, followed by the sound. It wasn't the thud of my body hitting the snow-cushioned ground. It was a sound that came from inside me. A dry, obscene crack that was loud enough to echo off the trees. My left femur. I knew it instantly. The pain was a white-hot nova that erased the world, followed by the insidious, deadly cold of the snow seeping through my clothes. I lay there, twisted and broken, staring at the gray sky, and I knew, with a calm and absolute certainty, that this was where I would die. I must have passed out. My last thought was of Sarah, of the quiet knoll where she rested, and a deep, weary regret that I wouldn't be buried beside her. Then, there was nothing. The next sensation was not the eternal cold I expected, but warmth. A coarse, heavy warmth. I was on my own porch, dragged out of the deep snowdrift I had landed in. The pain in my leg was a roaring fire. But the rest of me was wrapped in my thickest wool blanket, the one I kept in a cedar chest at the foot of my bed. I was in a daze, my mind struggling to bridge the gap between dying in the snow and lying here, sheltered from the wind. He had saved me. He had not only dragged me to safety, but had somehow retrieved the blanket from inside my home, or perhaps from the porch railing where I sometimes aired it out. He hadn't just rescued me, he had cared for me. The shock of it was so profound, it momentarily eclipsed the pain. Lying beside me on the weathered porch boards was a pile of freshly dug up camas roots, their bulbs still clotted with dark, rich earth. It was a direct reversal of our entire relationship. For decades, I had been the one leaving provisions. I was the provider, the helper. Now, I was the one who was broken, and he had brought me an offering. He was feeding me. He was fulfilling his side of the bargain in the most fundamental way imaginable. A trade is a trade. It was a statement of loyalty that no human being had ever shown me. I lay there, my broken body a testament to my own fragility, and understood that our pact was not one of convenience. It was a bond, as real and as solid as the ancient trees around us. That's when I saw him. The moon broke through the thick cloud cover for just a moment, casting a pale, ethereal light across the clearing. He was standing at the edge of the trees, a colossal silhouette of immense stillness. He wasn't looking at me, but at the cabin, as if ensuring the job was complete. Then, he turned his head, and in the fleeting moonlight, I saw his eyes. They weren't the eyes of a beast, nor were they filled with the calculating intelligence I'd seen before. They were filled with a profound, soul-deep weariness, an ancient sadness that seemed to hold the weight of millennia. In that one, silent glance, I saw not a monster or a cryptid, but a person, a being trapped in a form I couldn't comprehend, but a thinking, feeling person nonetheless. It wasn't an animal, not just an animal. He held my gaze for a heartbeat, then turned and melted back into the shadows, leaving me utterly changed. I was alone again, with the howling pain in my leg and a truth that was even more earth-shattering. He had touched me, moved me, wrapped me in a blanket. The barrier of mystery had been broken by an act of intimate care. I tried to push myself up, to drag myself the last few feet towards my door, when my hand brushed against something in the thin layer of snow on the porch. It was small, cold, and hard. It wasn't a rock or a piece of wood. It felt manufactured. My fingers, clumsy with cold and shock, closed around it. It must have fallen from him, snagged on his hair or hide as he dragged me from the snowbank. It was an accident, a piece of him left behind, a clue. And with every ounce of strength I had, I knew I had to see what it was. This was the first word spoken aloud in our 40-year silent conversation. With my good arm, I dragged myself across the porch and through the doorway, which he had left slightly ajar. The pain was excruciating, but the drive to see the object in my hand was stronger. I switched on a lamp with a trembling hand, its warm light flooding my small living room. I uncurled my fingers. Lying in my palm was a small, tarnished metal disc, looped through a broken chain. It was an old military dog tag, but cruder, thicker than the ones I'd worn. I held it closer to the light, my heart hammering against my ribs. There were no names, no dates, no blood type. There was just a single, stark line of stamped characters, cold and clinical. It read, XJ7. The letters and number were a brand, a designation from a world of steel, science, and cages. A world that had no place in this forest, but it had been here, and it had been on him. The next few weeks were a blur of pain and feverish thought. I managed to set my own leg in a crude splint, using snapped saplings and strips of deer hide. I was trapped inside my cabin, a prisoner of my own body. But my mind was racing. XJ7. I'd say it over and over, the name feeling like a curse in my mouth. I'd stare out the window for hours, watching the snowfall, watching the ridgeline. I saw him sometimes, a distant shape moving with his familiar limp, a limp that mirrored my own new, shuffling gait. We were two broken things, healing in parallel. The forest was quiet, but it was a different kind of quiet now. It wasn't the quiet of solitude. It was the quiet of a shared convalescence, the quiet of two fugitives hiding in the same foxhole, each tending to his own wounds while standing watch for the other. One afternoon, as the winter sun was beginning its low descent, it happened. He was moving through a patch of sparser trees on the far ridge, and the setting sun cut through the forest at a sharp angle, backlighting him in a blaze of orange. The light caught the wetness of his dark hair, and for a split second, it illuminated his back with perfect, unforgiving clarity. And I saw them. Beneath the thick mat of hair, the skin on his back was not smooth. It was covered in a faint, grid-like pattern of scars. They were not the jagged, chaotic scars of a bear fight or a fall down a ravine. They were perfectly straight lines, intersecting at precise right angles. They were surgical. They were the scars of 100 incisions, a map of methodical, repeated violation. They were the marks of a laboratory. I dropped the binoculars, my hands shaking so badly they couldn't hold them. The dog tag, the scars. It all crashed together in my mind with the force of a physical blow. The crude wooden bird he had given me, a thing made by a smaller, more human-like hand. His fierce protection of the mine. His refusal to leave this small patch of earth. He wasn't a natural wonder. He was an escapee. The weariness in his eyes wasn't just the burden of survival. It was the weariness of a prisoner, of a victim. The word specimen burned in my mind. The government never forgets. He wasn't hiding from the world. He was hiding from the people who gave him that number, from the people who had carved that grid into his skin. My role, My entire life had been redefined in that single flash of sunlight. I was no longer the guardian of a mystery. I was the accomplice to a fugitive. The secret I was keeping wasn't about a gentle giant in the woods. It was about what humanity was capable of doing to something it didn't understand. The loggers and the Sasquatch hunters were flies, insignificant annoyances. The real threat, the one that left surgical scars and stamped serial numbers onto living beings, was still out there. And I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that they would eventually come looking for their property. My quiet life was over. The game had changed, and the stakes were no longer just my peace of mind. They were his life, and the terrible truth he carried. If you believe that there are truths worth protecting, no matter the cost, then please, do me this one small kindness. Like this story, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss what's coming, and share this with someone who understands that some secrets must be kept. You need to stay until the very end, because what I'm about to tell you next is how they found us. The government always finds you. They came not with sirens, but with the quiet crunch of tires on my gravel driveway, a sound so foreign it was a violation in itself. It was a late spring morning, the air still damp from the night's rain. I was splitting firewood when I heard it, a low hum that didn't belong to the forest. I looked up and saw it, a quiet, dark green Subaru with government plates, its clean, anonymous shell, a jarring intrusion against the wild backdrop of my life. It parked near my woodshed, and for a long moment, nothing happened. The engine cut, and the silence that followed was the wrong kind. The dead quiet of hunters who have reached their destination. Two men got out. They didn't wear uniforms, but suits that looked wrong out here, their polished shoes already collecting mud. They moved with a placid confidence that was more menacing than any weapon. The patient, bureaucratic creep of the outside world had finally found my door. And I knew, with a certainty that turned the marrow in my bones to ice, that they were here for him. They weren't hunters. They were collectors. The men approached my porch slowly, their hands visible. One was older, with tired eyes and a suit that seemed a size too big. The other was younger, sharp, his gaze constantly scanning the tree line, the roof, the shadows. He was the real threat. The older one spoke first, his voice calm and reasonable. "Mr. Blackwood, I'm Agent Miller. This is Agent Thorne. We're with the Department of the Interior, Cold Case Archives." He offered a thin, professional smile that didn't reach his eyes. It was a lie, and we both knew it. The Department of the Interior doesn't send agents in pairs to the middle of nowhere. I just leaned on my axe, saying nothing, letting the silence be my answer. I let them see the wildness I had cultivated, the hermit from the stories. "We're investigating a lost experimental aircraft from a 1960s military program," Miller continued, his voice unwavering. "Codename Project Chimera. We have reason to believe it went down somewhere on or near your property." Project Chimera. The name was a key in a lock I didn't know I had. The younger agent, Thorne, spoke up, his voice sharper. "Our satellite imagery, Mr. Blackwood, has picked up a persistent, anomalous geothermal signature on your land." He pointed vaguely towards the North Ridge. "It's consistent with a decaying power source from that era. We need to send a survey team in to confirm its location and assess any environmental hazards. We'd need your cooperation to access the North Ridge." They had their story, and it was perfect, plausible, technical, and it gave them a legal pretext to be exactly where they wanted to go. The mine. My blood ran cold. They weren't looking for a geothermal signature. They were scanning for a life sign, a body heat bloom in the cold rock. They had a heat signature because he was there, sheltering in the deep, constant temperature of the earth. They knew the what, but they were playing dumb about the who. They were fishing, and they were using the most sophisticated bait in the world, the full, unimpeachable authority of the United States government. Agent Miller tried a different tactic, pulling a file from his coat. "We have your service record, Silas, Marines, good man. Served your country with distinction. You're a patriot. We're just two government men trying to do our job, tying up a loose end for national security." The use of my first name was a calculated violation, an attempt to forge a bond of shared duty that I wanted no part of. He was trying to put us on the same side, to frame my cooperation as a continuation of the oath I took 50 years ago. But the jungle had taught me about men who used patriotism as a weapon. I looked from his earnest, lying face to Thorn's cold, watchful eyes. And I knew this wasn't about a lost plane. They didn't want to find a piece of metal. They wanted to retrieve a piece of property. They wanted XJ7. And they were using my own history, my own sense of honor, as a lever to pry open my world and steal the one thing I had sworn to protect. They were asking the wrong man for help. I finally spoke, my voice a low rasp from disuse. There's nothing on that ridge but rock and bad memories. The mine's been collapsed for 60 years. Whatever your satellites see, it's a ghost. I let my eyes drift, unfocused, a trick I learned to seem more unhinged, less reliable. You're wasting your time. There's nothing here for you. I turned my back on them and resumed my work, splitting a log with a single, sharp crack of the axe. It was a clear dismissal, an act of defiance. For a moment, there was only the sound of the wind in the firs. I could feel their eyes on my back. Thorn was the one who broke the silence. "This isn't a request, Mr. Blackwood. We were trying to be respectful, given your service." His voice had lost all pretense of friendliness. It was as cold and hard as the barrel of a gun. "If we don't get voluntary compliance, we will be back. With a federal warrant and a writ of eminent domain, this will become a federal survey site. You will not be allowed to interfere." That was the real threat, the one I couldn't fight with an axe or a shotgun. Bureaucracy, the slow, grinding power of the state to simply take what it wants. They got in their quiet car and drove away, leaving a cloud of dust and the heavy silence of a threat delivered. The government never forgets. The paranoia was no longer a feeling. It was a physical weight, a presence that saturated the air. My sanctuary was gone. The forest was no longer a place of solitude. It was an unsecured perimeter. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig sent a jolt of ice through my gut. Was it him, moving through the trees? Or was it them, already back, watching from the shadows with their thermal optics? I was a prisoner on my own land, and the woods, my only friend for 40 years, had become a cage. The familiar sounds of my home had become a language of threats I could no longer decipher. My silence, my greatest defense, was now my greatest vulnerability. 2 days later, the real siege began. It started as a high, thin whine, a sound like a mosquito in your ear that you can't locate. Then I saw it. A drone, a silent metal wasp, crisscrossing the sky in a perfect, methodical grid pattern high above the canopy. Then another appeared, and another. They were mapping every inch of my land, their cameras and sensors stripping the forest of its secrets, layer by layer. The intrusion was absolute, a violation more profound than any physical trespass. They were watching from the heavens, unseen and untouchable. Our ritual was broken. I couldn't go to the clearing anymore. I couldn't leave food or check for signs. The risk of leading their mechanical eyes directly to him was too great. The invisible line of our pact, the quiet understanding we had built over decades, was severed by the cold, indifferent gaze of technology. I was cut off from him, and he was alone with the hunters in the sky. The forest fell into that other kind of silence again, the dead quiet, the one full of unseen watchers. The wood knocks from the ridge ceased. The responsive hums that warned of weather changes were gone. He knew, of course he knew. He had seen the metal birds in the sky, heard their alien whine. I'd catch a glimpse of him sometimes, a flicker of movement deep in the shadows. But he was more ghost-like than ever before. He was moving with a new kind of caution, a deeper level of stealth. He was no longer just hiding from the occasional hunter. He was hiding from an omniscient eye in the sky. The weight of his loneliness, his weariness, pressed down on me. For 44 years, I had been his buffer against the world. Now, I was just a tether, an anchor point that had led the enemy straight to his door. He was trapped, and it was my fault. My presence was no longer a protection, it was a beacon for his destroyers. I felt the walls closing in, the inevitability of what was coming. The agents would be back, soon. They wouldn't come with questions next time. They'd come with a team, with equipment, with federal marshals to enforce a court order. They would seal off the land, my land. They would drill into that mine, and they would find him. They would drag him out of the darkness and into the light, back to the world of cages and needles and serial numbers that was stamped onto his very skin. The thought of it was a physical sickness. I couldn't let that happen. Standing by and watching them take him would be the final, unforgivable betrayal, a sin worse than anything I had run from in the jungle. My pact was with him, not with a government that used patriotism as a crowbar. A trade is a trade. He had saved my life. Now, I had to be willing to lose mine to save his. The time for hiding was over. I knew there was only one path left. I had to go to him. I had to break the one rule he had ever given me, the one boundary I had sworn to respect. I had to cross the line marked by the old, dead cedar tree. I had to go to the mine. I needed to warn him, to show him the drone, to make him understand that this was different, that the threat was here and it wasn't leaving. I had to convince him to run, to abandon his post, to flee deeper into the national forest where they might never find him. I packed a small bug-out bag with dried meat, a water filter, a compass, and the old tarnished dog tag, the XJ7 tag. It was the only piece of truth I had. As dusk began to fall, painting the sky in shades of bruised purple and blood orange, I stepped off my porch and headed for the North Ridge. I was walking into the heart of his secret, and I had no idea if he would see me as an ally, or as the final threat to what he was guarding. I reached the boundary, the skeletal form of the dead cedar stark against the last light. My heart was a frantic drum against my ribs. I knelt and picked up a stone. Tapping it against a large boulder in the sequence he had taught me meant danger. 2 quick taps, a pause, then one long, slow one. For a moment, only the whine of the distant drones answered. Then, he emerged from the dense shadows of the mine's entrance, a giant of fury and fear. He was agitated, his head tilted towards the sky, tracking the path of the silent wasps. He knew they were here. I held up my hands, showing I was unarmed, that I was an ally. I expected him to bolt, to finally flee. Instead, he took a step towards me, his immense hand reaching out. He took my arm, his grip surprisingly gentle for its power, and pulled me not away from the danger, but directly towards it, into the forbidden darkness of the old silver mine. The air inside was cold, still, and smelled of damp stone and something else, something metallic and ancient. The drone's whine faded, replaced by the sound of our footsteps echoing in the oppressive silence. He led me deeper, his hand never leaving my arm, guiding me through the winding blackness with an unnerving familiarity. This was not a shelter. This was a home. After what felt like an eternity, we arrived in a small, dry chamber, far from the entrance, shielded from any satellite's prying eye. A thin sliver of moonlight penetrated a crack high in the rock ceiling, illuminating the space in a ghostly twilight. As my eyes adjusted, I saw that the walls were not smooth. They were covered in crude etchings, a library of sorrow carved into the stone. My breath hitched. I wasn't just in his hiding place, I was in his memory. I was standing in the heart of the secret he was willing to die for. He released my arm and gestured to the wall with one long, deliberate finger. I raised my lantern, its yellow light sliding across the stone, and the story unfolded. I saw a drawing of a man in a lab coat, his face a featureless oval, holding a long, thin needle. Next to it, a crude but unmistakable drawing of a cage made of straight, harsh lines. Then, a drawing of himself, his form powerful even in the simple etching, but his eyes were drawn as hollow circles of despair. His gaze was fixed on the cage. He let out a low, guttural sound, a sound of remembered pain, and I knew I was looking at a history of torment. The surgical scars on his back, the XJ7 tag, it all began here, in a sterile room far from any forest, under the unblinking eye of men who saw him not as a being, but as a thing to be catalogued and taken apart. The truth was worse than I could have imagined. He then moved his finger to the most painful drawing of all. It was a depiction of him, but next to him was a smaller figure, clearly a child of his species, its hand drawn reaching for his. The love in that simple, carved line was universal, unmistakable. He tapped the drawing of the child. Then he pointed a trembling finger straight up, towards the rock ceiling, towards the sky above. A sound tore from his throat, a choked, guttural rasp that fought its way past an eternity of silence. It was a sound I had never heard before, a broken, desperate attempt to mimic a human word he must have heard long ago. Gone. The single, shattered word hung in the cold air of the cavern, a gravestone for a loss I couldn't comprehend. The truth hit me like a physical blow, knocking the air from my lungs. The secret wasn't what he was. The secret was what had been taken from him. It all crashed into place, a terrible, perfect mosaic of cruelty. XJ7. He wasn't a cryptid or a missing link. He was a survivor, a visitor. His vessel had crashed, and he and his child were captured by Project Chimera. The government hadn't been testing an experimental aircraft. They had been experimenting on a family. They had taken his child, gone you to some other facility, some other black site, and he had somehow escaped. He didn't stay on this ridge to hide. He stayed because this was his last point of contact, the place his world had ended. He wasn't guarding a territory. He was standing vigil at a grave that held only a memory. The wood knocks, the warnings, the fierce protection. It was all the desperate hope of a father who refused to believe his child was lost forever. The FBI wasn't hunting a monster. They were bearing a secret far bigger than Bigfoot, the secret of first contact and the sin they committed when it happened. We emerged from the mine into the cold pre-dawn air, and they were there. Agents Miller and Thorne stood at the entrance, their forms silhouetted against the graying sky. They weren't holding rifles, just standing there, waiting patiently. They hadn't needed to hunt us. They just needed to wait for the secret to reveal itself. The drones were gone. The silence was absolute. The creature stood beside me, not cowering, but radiating a powerful, defiant stillness. He had shown me his truth, and now we would face the consequences together. Agent Thorne had a hand near his jacket, but it was Miller who looked at me, his face etched with a weary resignation. He looked like a man who hated his job, but who would do it without hesitation. The moment had finally arrived. The quiet war I had fought for 44 years was about to end in a final, silent confrontation at the mouth of this stony tomb. I stepped forward, my body trembling not with fear, but with a righteous, burning anger. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the tarnished metal disc. I held it up so the first rays of dawn caught the stamped letters. Project Chimera wasn't an aircraft, I said, my voice shaking but carrying in the still air. It was him. It was his child. I looked Miller square in the eye. And I've kept a log. For 44 years. Every trade, every warning, every sound. I have the wooden bird. I have the dates. I know what you are. I know what you did. It wasn't a threat. It was a testament. In that moment, I wasn't a hermit. I was a witness. The creature beside me made a low sound, a rumble of agreement. He placed a heavy hand on my shoulder, a gesture of solidarity that anchored me to the ground. We were not two separate beings anymore. We were a single story. The twist wasn't a firefight. It was a deal born of exhaustion. Agent Miller sighed, a sound that seemed to carry the weight of decades of secrets. A log won't bring down a government, Silas, he said, his voice devoid of malice. It'll just get you both killed, and we'll classify it as a bear attack. The story dies. Always. He looked from me to the massive, grieving figure beside me, and for a second, I saw a flicker of something human in his eyes. Pity, maybe, or shame. But this is a loose end that will never be tied. He'll never stop looking. We'll never stop watching. Then came the offer, the final, impossible move on the chessboard. So we make a new deal, not a lie, but a new truth. We wipe the slate. We call off the search. The geothermal anomaly is declared a volcanic vent. But the secret has to have a keeper, a real one. You go with him, he said, his gaze unflinching. You become the ghost story. We erase Silas Blackwood, and you spend the rest of your life making sure he never comes near our world again. It was the ultimate payoff, the ultimate price. To protect him, I had to disappear entirely. I looked back in the direction of my cabin, a place I could no longer see but could feel in my bones. I thought of the tin roof, the warmth of the wood stove, of Sarah's grave on the knoll. My whole life, a phantom limb I was being asked to sever. Then I looked at the creature beside me, at the ancient sorrow in his eyes, at the hand still resting on my shoulder. What was my small life compared to his immense loss? What was my solitude compared to his endless, lonely vigil? It was never a choice. Not really. A trade is a trade. I gave Agent Miller a single, slow nod. I turned my back on my home, my past, my name, and with the first rays of the rising sun warming my face, I walked into the endless green of the Olympic forest with him. My final moral act was to become a secret myself. My name is no longer on any records. These tapes are my last will and testament. a ghost's confession left for the world he abandoned. The man they called Silas Blackwood is dead, buried under a mountain of federal redactions. I learned more about loyalty and honor from this creature they called a monster than I ever did from the world of men. Humanity, I've learned, is not a species. It's a choice. It's a choice you make when you're broken in the snow, when you're staring at a cage you can't open, when you decide that another's life is more valuable than your own history. We travel now, always moving deeper. And sometimes, at night, when the stars are bright, he makes a new sound. It's not a sound of warning or of grief. It's a low, resonant hum, a question aimed at the sky, a question I hope one day gets an answer. My story is over. His is not. If you've listened this far, thank you for being my witness. Please, help me keep this truth alive. Like this story, subscribe to the channel, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and be sure to watch the next recording that appears on your screen. Some ghosts deserve to be heard.